for Trump when he was saying that none of this was real, this is all a hoax. This is not a hoax. Like, did you not know? Maybe he didn't know, if you want to be charitable. But this is definitely not a hoax. And if you got redacted people's names and these people aren't victims, you're not protecting the victims. So what are you doing? Right. And how come all this shit is not released?
You just get all of it with just
like
get rid of all of it. Just expel it all.
It's crazy. So this is the conspiracy that drives me the most crazy. I don't like it. The fear of these literally demonic human beings that are running the world and don't give a fuck about human lives and enjoy watching people being tortured, enjoy watching people killed, participating in ritual sacrifice of people, and they do it in order to show that you're a part of a team and we know that has always historically been a real thing. And it's been something that you look at in history, you go, God, it's so sick. It's so twisted. It's so disgusting. And everybody wants to think, thank God that's not happening now. But then when you realize, that might have been happening now.
And another co-conspirator that was named recently is Les Wexner, the former CEO of Victoria's Secret, who's a billionaire that gave Epstein his New York City mansion and power of attorney over his finances. So people knew he was involved. It's not a big surprise. But now we have more proof. Also, Trump's administration was trying to protect him, too. His name was redacted. So Joe was talking about that and brought up Whitney Webb, who's probably the most well-versed reporter of all the Epstein stuff. She's done a ton of research and written books about it. And she pointed out Wexner's role in Epstein's operation in 2020. And that's why Joe brings her up. He also says he could have her on his podcast, which is kind of surprising because she's also very critical of Joe's tech friends and their involvement with Epstein. So I'm surprised Rogan's handlers would allow her to come on. But also at this point, I don't know if she'd even want to go on there because Rogan's so close with the Epstein class, she might think it would hurt her credibility.
By the way, Whitney Webb posted on her Twitter about Les Wexner being a trafficker, a child sex trafficker, in 2020. That crazy chick is right about everything. Your reminder that Leslie Wexner financed the mass and trafficking of thousands of American children for over a decade, and right now he is sitting in a 26K square foot mansion in New Albany, Ohio, thinking that he is above the law. She tweeted this in April 28 of 2020. How crazy is that? Shit. She's the most prolific of all the conspiracy theorists, the most well-read, the one with the most recall, the one that's the most quoted. I don't know how she's so good at it. We're trying to get her on. I don't know how she's so good and what her background is, how she finds all this information, but she's always way ahead of all this stuff.
Yeah, 2020.
That's crazy.
That's fucking way ahead of everybody.
Crazy. Bro. But these files, just what's come out so far, and the fact that they redacted men, these powerful billionaire guys, their names were redacted.
And another thing Whitney was way ahead of is Elon Musk's connection to Epstein. But obviously Rogan does not want to hear about that. That's his buddy. But Whitney called this out almost 3 years ago, maybe even longer. She talked about it on PBD's podcast about 3 years ago. And she said Elon has a fake persona that he betrays to the public. And he isn't truthful about his ties to Epstein, which he was 100% right about. Elon lied about this so much, it's crazy. He originally claimed he was photobombed by Ghislaine Maxwell in that picture with her. He said he didn't think Epstein toured SpaceX. He said he denied every invitation to the island and barely knew him. But that was all bullshit. He communicated with him quite a bit. He tried to get to the island, but Epstein canceled on him. Also, he gave Epstein a tour of SpaceX, and his brother was set up with girls by Epstein. And when he was talking about this stuff 3 years ago, so she nailed it here. But of course, I doubt Rogan would let her talk about all this on his podcast.
I see Elon Musk as a person who has a very specific persona he wants to project to the public, and then there's business Musk, right? And I don't think they're necessarily always the same person. For example, Elon Musk, a lot of people maybe forget, he's a big military contractor. And also, the Space Force, that's also an intelligence agency, so he's technically a military and intelligence contractor. A lot of his companies would not have been successful without significant subsidies from the government. So I feel like in order to get those deals, there's certain rules you have to abide by to an extent. So maybe he wants to project, this persona of I'm one of the bros, I'm one of the guys, I believe in free speech and all of this. And certainly when he bought Twitter, that's what he said, but then it became, oh yeah, free speech, but not freedom of reach. And, I personally, just from my own experience with Epstein research, I have found Musk not to be very upfront about some of those connections there. So, for example, he'll be like, a lot of people like to bring up the picture of him and Ghislaine Maxwell from 2014. He'll say he was photobombed and all of this. Reporters seem to have forgotten that Kimball Musk, his brother, who's on the board of Tesla and SpaceX, was introduced to a member of Epstein's entourage who had dated Epstein and lived at the apartment where all these traffic girls lived. A girl from there starts dating Kimball Musk, and somehow Epstein is allegedly granted access to SpaceX facilities and tours, and then is allegedly advising Tesla, according to the New York Times reporter James Stewart. This is during a time when Musk is saying he's trying to secure capital to take Tesla private, I believe, and this was allegedly involving one of the Saudi wealth funds of the Saudi government. And at that time, Epstein was a very, very close advisor to Mohammed bin Salman, who had recently come to power.
Yeah, and also the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was really close with Epstein. So I'm sure Bill Burr, Andrew Schultz, and all the comedians that took money from him will have a lot to say about that. No, I mean, they'll all talk about how evil all the billionaires are in the files, and then take money from a trillionaire that was really good friends with Epstein. So, speaking of that, Schultz has been railing against Elon for being in the files. Same thing with Brendan Schaub. He surprised a lot of people, and he's actually had a good take on the files. But his co-host, Brian Callen, has had maybe the worst, and he's been getting a lot of backlash for it. Like, even Schaub has been giving him a ton of shit for it. So it's good to see some of Rogan's friends aren't afraid to talk about how bad this is, and the fact that Elon Musk was trying to get to Epstein's island. Because obviously, so far, Rogan has been too scared to talk about it. I don't think he even wants to look at those messages. He's probably trying to convince himself it's not real and they're AI or something. I'm sure that's what Elon will try to tell him.
You know what Elon Musk said? Have you seen those emails?
Yeah, he basically said if you
No.
he wanted to go to the party, the wild.
Exact words were, "Let me know the wildest party." And then his brother was actually in the parties, and the code name was supposed to be Pussy Chaos or something like that.
I think he was like, "Hey, let's go to an orgy."
Party.
Yeah, there are a lot of people in these emails that clearly were like, "You got a bunch of Russian girls, and I can go on an island." That's a separate thing. Okay, that's a separate thing. You want to be a freak and get your freak on or whatever.
The fact that Elon's trying to go to the parties and
Wow, this
and Epstein's just like, hey man, we actually canceled the parties.
he sent that email on Christmas Day. This guy got like 11,000 kids, and on Christmas Day, he's wondering where's the crazy party at. He is in like a unique situation because he didn't go to the island, but he desperately tried to go to the wildest party. Like if Epstein was like, we just kind of have like a normal party today. He's like, well, when's the wildest? Right. That means he must have heard that wild shit happens at the islands.
Absolutely.
Because why even suggest that?
Yeah.
This is the conspiracy that drives me the most crazy. Because I don't like it. Like if you're going over to your nerd friend's house, you're not going, when's the wildest dinner?
Yeah.
You know your nerd friend has boring dinners, and you're like, okay, I'll just come to any dinner.
Yeah.
He's specifically asking for the wildest shit. This is the one that I hate the most.
Yeah.
Because this one scares the shit out of me.
I want the craziest party of all time.
That
I
was
want
the
wildest
saddest shit I've ever seen.
And Epstein's like, oh yeah, man. Like he's trying to talk in code.
He curbs Elon. He was too hungry. Is Elon the corniest billionaire?
Dude. So all the positive PR Rogan's been doing for Elon over the years is now being all undone. Like Rogan's always said, Elon's the coolest and his favorite billionaire, which is just cringy as hell. But now there's always going to be an elephant in the room whenever Joe talks about him, or when he has him on. That's going to be really interesting. I wonder if Rogan has the balls to bring this up to him. I doubt it. But let me know what you guys think. And if you want to stay up to date with everything, make sure you check out the Patreon. I just posted a new video about how MAGA's calling for Trump to sue Tim Dillon. And I also covered Alex Jones's crash out, which I was talking about at the beginning of this video. That was great. Make sure you check it out. It's definitely worth it. There'll be a link in the description.
Over the last 2 seasons, the only team in the Premier League throughout that period to have won fewer points than Tottenham Hotspur are Wolverhampton Wanderers, one of the worst Premier League teams of all time. Last season, Spurs finished 17th, just 1 place above the relegation zone, in what was broadly considered to be an aberration. It was the club's lowest league finish in almost 50 years, when the club was last relegated, but it was contrasted with the euphoria of winning the Europa League. In a season which was billed as Bilbao or bust for both Tottenham and Manchester United, it was Spurs who came out on top, not only salvaging an otherwise disastrous season, but winning their first major trophy in 17 years and qualifying for the Champions League in the process. From both a sporting and a financial perspective, not to mention the impact in terms of pride and all-round morale, it felt like a monumental moment. Instead of a nadir in the modern history of the club, Tottenham could look forward to a season of Champions League football, a chunky budget, and an attractive sales pitch to prospective signings. A painful parting of the ways with Ange Postecoglou was deemed a necessary evil by most, and his successor Thomas Frank had a stellar CV during his time at Brentford, taking the Bees from mid-table in the Championship to 4 successive seasons of comfortable Premier League survival, including 2 top-half finishes. It appeared as though there were reasons to be cheerful at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. Spurs' £1 billion mega stadium opened in 2019 and described by some as the best stadium in the world. That optimism didn't last long. Since winning 5 of his opening 9 Premier League games, which left Spurs sitting pretty in third, Thomas Frank's side have only won 2 of their last 17 Premier League matches, and none of their last 8. It leaves Spurs only 5 points above West Ham, who have won 3 of their last 5, in addition to drawing against a resurgent Manchester United. Talk of relegation is no longer gentle ribbing by Tottenham's rivals or catastrophising among the club's own supporters. It is a perfectly plausible prospect for a team that has been woeful in the Premier League for almost 2 whole years. It should be unthinkable. Tottenham are the 9th richest football club in the world in terms of revenue, above Chelsea, Borussia Dortmund, and literally any Italian club, and they have the most expensive purpose-built football stadium of any club on the planet. Tottenham had 12 matches to prevent it from becoming the most expensive stadium in the Championship, though, a level which the club has only spent 1 season playing at in over 75 years. If they win as many games as they have in their last 17, they will go down. And yet, they just advanced to the knockout stages of the Champions League, seeded as the 4th best team in Europe, above PSG, Barcelona, and Real Madrid. So just what on earth is going on? Well, it's funny that you should ask. It feels like about 50,000 of you have over the last week, because that's what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to one of the best stadiums in the world, which currently hosts, statistically, one of the most out-of-form teams in Europe, in an attempt to make some sense of Tottenham's diabolical predicament, how deep the rot runs, and whether they can get out of it. Since the 7th of April 2024, Tottenham have played 71 Premier League matches. They've won 20 of them. Over the same period, for context, Thomas Frank's former club Brentford, whose revenue and stadium are both less than a third of the size of Tottenham's, have won 31, meanwhile their North London rivals Arsenal, who Tottenham finished above for 6 straight seasons between 2016-17 and 2021-22, have won 43. During the last 14 months, as pointed out by journalist Colin Miller on social media, Spurs have won more games in Europe, 12 from 21 matches, than they have in the Premier League, 11 from 48 games. This is a large enough sample size to conclude that, whatever the faults of Ange Postecoglou and Thomas Frank, of which it could fairly be argued that there are or were several, Tottenham are not a very good football team. This isn't simply a super team suffering a blip, and make no mistake, Spurs are a super team by every metric off the pitch. It is a bunch of not especially impressive footballers in a not especially impressive team achieving not especially impressive results. And the term not especially impressive there is me being very generous. When you compare the Tottenham team now to the one that started in the 2019 Champions League final, just 5 months before Mauricio Pochettino was sacked, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is a club which must have been hit with some kind of apocalyptic, unforeseen events. Administration, a points deduction, and an enforced relegation might explain it, or perhaps a natural disaster hitting M17. Not only has nothing of the sort happened, quite the opposite is true. Spurs moved into the widely lauded and incredibly lucrative Tottenham Hotspur Stadium in 2019, and the club's fundamentals have only gone from strength to strength. Revenue grew to an all-time high £550 million in the 2022-23 season, despite Tottenham finishing 8th, which made Spurs officially the 9th richest football club on the planet. That's a position which the club still occupied in the most recent 2026 Deloitte Football Money League standings, which is a full 7 places higher than they currently rank in the Premier League, let alone within the whole of world football. The most obvious explanation for this catastrophe is recruitment. Tottenham's best player over the last 10 years came through the club's own youth ranks, and their second best player throughout that time was signed in 2015 before Donald Trump's first administration. That is just a frame of reference to how long ago it was. I'm not suggesting that Trump's election in 2016 is the primary cause for Spurs' weak recruitment, though naturally, we can't rule it out. Contrary to popular opinion, Spurs have spent quite heavily in recent years. Over the last 5 years, since the start of the 2020-21 season, Tottenham have spent just shy of £1 billion, or in excess of €8 billion. They are one of only 7 clubs to eclipse that figure throughout world football during that time, 6 of them Premier League clubs plus PSG, with their net spend ranking as the 4th highest in England and the world, and their overall expenditure also ranking 4th in England and 5th in the world, narrowly behind the reigning European champions PSG. Spurs have spent more money than Arsenal and Liverpool in gross terms during that time, and more than Man City and PSG in net terms. This isn't a club that is unwilling to spend on new signings. What Tottenham very rarely do, however, is drop enormous sums on individual players. Dominic Solanke is still Tottenham's club record signing, at a reported £55 million plus £10 million in potential future add-ons, which isn't even enough to crack the top 80 most expensive signings of all time, according to the website Transfermarkt. Spurs paid significantly less for their club record signing than Manchester United paid for either Romelu Lukaku or Angel Di Maria, almost and over a decade ago, and more than Chelsea paid for Mykhailo Mudryk, someone who you had almost certainly forgotten existed. That may be partly down to how badly things have gone, on the very rare occasions in which Spurs have broken the bank. Out of Tottenham's 10 most expensive signings, I don't think a single one of them could be described as a total and unmitigated success story, whereas a few of them could be described as total and unmitigated failures. Tanguy and Ndombele, perhaps most notably, who broke the club's transfer record in 2019 when a reported £62 million arrival from Lyon made him the 6th most expensive signing in the Premier League that season, had a miserable 5 years at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, in which he was loaned out 3 times and was accused of gaining 3 stone and having a poor work ethic. Solanke, meanwhile, has only scored 11 goals in 34 Premier League games since joining Spurs, suffering from a number of injury problems. It's too early to pass judgment on Xavi Simons and Mohamed Kudus. Richarlison flatters to deceive, with about 1 good game in 3, which isn't great for a reported £50 to £60 million signing subject to add-ons, and Brennan Johnson has already been sold for a not insignificant loss. Spurs may well be permanently scarred from their record when going big, by their standards at least, but that trepidation, in several instances, is doing them more harm than good. It was never going to be easy to replace players like Harry Kane and Son Heung-min. In fact, in the former case, I would argue that it was most likely impossible, but if you take the case of Son, he had diminished returns in his final season, and it wasn't exactly a huge shock when he announced his intention to leave the club after 10 years. Even if that wasn't the case, Spurs ought to have had a contingency plan in place when it came to identifying successors to their talisman. Spurs reportedly made approaches for 2-time Champions League winning Real Madrid wildman Rodrigo, Nottingham Forest main man Morgan Gibbs-White, Crystal Palace star Eberechi Eze, and Bournemouth wildcard Antoine Semenyo. They didn't get any of them. Rodrigo always seemed like a long shot, with the player himself widely reported to have been unconvinced by the move. Meanwhile, the unusual Gibbs-White situation was somewhat taken out of their hands, but both Eze and Semenyo were absolutely viable targets and realistic prospects at one stage. Eze grew up supporting Tottenham's rivals Arsenal and spent 5 years in their academy before he was let go, so it made sense that when it came down to it, he chose to join the Gunners. But Spurs potentially need never have let it get to that stage. They led the pursuit of Eze following his heroics in last season's FA Cup final, but in typical Tottenham style, they refused to meet his £68 million release clause, reportedly attempting to drive the price down by tabling an offer worth £50 million, plus £5 million in potential future add-ons. It was reported at the time that Eze informed Crystal Palace of his desire to join Spurs, but Steve Parish wasn't happy with the fee. When Arsenal entered the race to sign Eze at the 11th hour, by contrast, there was no haggling. They decided that Eze was their man, and they coughed up the reported £68 million required to get him. Whilst Tottenham's transfer saga rumbled on then, the time between Arsenal's interest being made public and Eze being pictured in a red shirt felt like it could be measured in minutes. In the words of Giorgio Chiellini, this is the history of Tottenham. The same thing happened with Semenyo. Spurs were the first super club, if you like, to officially enter the race for Semenyo back in June, following a season in which he scored 13 goals and made 7 assists, but they balked at Bournemouth's reported £65 million valuation. In fairness to Spurs, they weren't alone. Manchester United also reportedly deemed the deal to be too rich for them, and you know it's bad when Man United think that a player's overpriced, but then again, the Red Devils signed Matheus Cunha and one of Tottenham's top targets, Brian Mbeumo, for more than Spurs have ever paid for a player in the same window. If Spurs determined that Eze and Semenyo were the solutions, they had to pull the trigger and be bold with at least one of them. Even if they deemed the fees to be too high, it is about more than fair value. Spurs needed to send out a statement of intent to everyone else following their Europa League win. Meanwhile, Enoch and the club's new leadership committee, following Daniel Levy's departure, needed to signal to the club's own supporters that Tottenham was a club under new management and that there was a newfound sense of ambition and direction. Instead, the perception, and the reality it seems, projected to insiders and outsiders, was that it was business as usual at Tottenham. In January, Semenyo joined Man City for a reported £64 million, following 10 goals and 3 assists in the first half of the season at Bournemouth. In his last game for the Cherries, he scored the winning goal in a 3-2 victory against Spurs. In only his third game for Man City, he scored against Spurs again in a 2-2 draw. Following Tottenham's 4-0 defeat to Bayern Munich in pre-season, Thomas Frank told reporters that Spurs didn't need to replace Son, and so they didn't. Frank is a very capable and savvy media operator who navigated a lot of noise off the pitch this season quite shrewdly, but his own efforts to downplay Tottenham's talents and prospects this season, something which a lot of managers do these days to try and reduce the pressure on themselves, only perpetuated the impression of post-Levy continuity, and the idea that Frank himself was little more than a yes-man for the new regime in the eyes of most fans. Whilst Tottenham's transfer spending is competitive but diversified, with an emphasis on young players of potential sell-on value as opposed to ready-made superstars, their wage bill, which helps explain this phenomenon, is anything but. Spurs have been firmly a big six or rich six club in terms of revenue for a fairly long time now, but their wage bill hasn't always reflected that fact. Tottenham's wage bill peaked at £251 million in the 2022-23 season, the season before Harry Kane left for Bayern Munich, which is £17 million less than Aston Villa's wage bill last season. Villa were in the Championship in 2019, when Spurs reached the Champions League final, and despite a meteoric rise since then, and playing Champions League football last season whilst Tottenham didn't, their revenue is still only 2/3 the size of Spurs's. Tottenham's wage bill is actually closer to Burnley's or Championship Leicester City's, and much closer to the likes of Wolves, Brentford and Bournemouth's, than it is to either Liverpool or Manchester City's. Spurs spend just 44% of their turnover on wages, which is the lowest percentage in the Premier League, and the joint lowest across Europe's Big Five leagues, tied with Real Madrid, whose wage bill is actually over 70% higher than theirs, but they have the highest revenue of any football club on the planet. This is great in terms of sustainability and ensuring that the club is on a strong financial footing, but inevitably, As has been very well documented at this stage, it means that Tottenham are, for the most part, fishing in very different waters to the rest of the Premier League's so-called big six. They are shopping in much more similar markets, at least in terms of wage demands, to Aston Villa and Newcastle United. The end result is that when Son Heung-min joined LAFC for an MLS record fee in the summer, his replacements were Wilson Odobert and Matthias Tal. I have no interest in criticising individual players, and both Odobert and Tal may well turn out to be superstars in their own right, but at this moment in time, they are 20 and 21 years old, and they have 3 Premier League goals between them this season. If that is the calibre of player that you are replacing Son Heung-min with, in the here and now, you are only heading in one direction. The left flank is just one example, and a particularly pointed one as a result of Son's profile, but the same is true in virtually every position, with only the highly debatable exception of centre-back. In my view, Tottenham have lots of fairly good, or, at the very least, capable mid-table Premier League players. You could take the likes of João Palhinha, Javi Simons, Pedro Porro, or Rodrigo Bentancur, to name just a few examples, and put them in the Man City or Arsenal squads, and they most likely wouldn't look out of place, and would do a capable job as squad players. What Spurs lack, distinctly, is superstars, game changers, and match winners. They are sort of synonyms. Forget Erling Haaland or Bruno Fernandes, at the level of clubs that Tottenham's revenue suggests that they should be rivaling for elite players. West Ham have Jarrod Bowen, Everton have Iliman Ndiaye, heck, even Dominic Calvert-Lewin has 10 Premier League goals at Leeds United this season. Who have Spurs got? Mohamed Kudus has his moments but is currently out injured, though it's worth noting that he too has only scored 2 goals in 19 Premier League games this season. Richarlison is Tottenham's top scorer this season with 7 Premier League goals, but as mentioned earlier, he blows extremely hot and cold. Javi Simons is yet to hit the ground running, also still aged only 22, and Dominic Solanke has looked anonymous when fit this season, with the sole exception of his brace against Manchester City, and him being fit hasn't been very often. It's all pretty bleak. There's certainly no one at Tottenham with a talismanic presence or match-winning capabilities of Jarrod Bowen, which ought to fear Spurs fans heading into the run-in, and ought to shame and embarrass the club's senior management and directors. It is at this point, as in last season's video about Tottenham, that one must acknowledge an almost unprecedented injury crisis. If last season was catastrophic for Spurs in terms of injuries, then this season has been positively apocalyptic. Tottenham have been without James Maddison and Dejan Kulusevski, probably their 2 leading creative outlets all season, with Kulusevski's unusual knee injury still having no clear end in sight, and Maddison not expected to return from his ACL injury this season. They have been without Ben Davies, Destiny Udogie, Radu Dragushin, Dominic Solanke, and Nevis Basuma for most of this season, and Pedro Porro, Rodrigo Bentancur, Richarlison, Lucas Bergvall, and Mohamed Kudus, all of whom are currently injured for extended spans. When Basuma found return, having been out all season, he jetted onto the African Cup of Nations, along with Pathmatar Sarr. This is a mid-table squad of the best of
Ahí se van a quedar todos a la chingada. Hay que comer huevos, que pidan dinero no, ahí hay huevos, ahí hay carne, que se pongan a hacer en la freidora. Les dices que saquen la comida para que se descongele y ahí que la donen. Nada que vamos con araceli y que esto que el otro no van a ir a ningún
A las 6 yo no voy a ir para la pelos.
Ok, bueno. Pantalones que no te queden, no me da todo bien.
In terms of performances and results. Consequently, Postecoglou was reluctant to rest and rotate players, but he increased physical demands on them as Tottenham went deep in Europe, which only exacerbated their injury problems. Because so many of those were long-term setbacks, Thomas Frank inherited and was left with little room to rotate, even if he had adopted a different strategy, meaning that there is little to no rest time for Tottenham's depleted squad, hence why the injuries haven't led up. It feels as though Spurs suffer a fresh injury setback to a senior player virtually every game, creating a predicament whereby, whatever you think of Frank, it is virtually unworkable for any manager. Nonetheless, even when Spurs had relatively okay availability, at least by their standards. Take the 0-0 draw with Thomas Frank's former club Brentford at the start of January, in which Guillermo Vicario, Pedro Porro, Christian Romero, Mickey van der Ven, Jed Spence, Rodrigo Bentancur, João Palhinha, Archie Gray, Mohamed Kudus, Richarlison and Wilson Odobert were all available and started the game. Tottenham's performance was still totally uninspiring, as Brentford saw more of the ball, created the better opportunities, and Spurs was somewhat fortuitous to escape from that game with a point. It is true to say that Thomas Frank was handed a very weak hand, and that the problems at Tottenham run far deeper than him. That much is obvious. Spurs have had a new manager basically every season, or a couple of seasons if you include caretaker bosses. By any conceivable metric, however, including Tottenham's own logic, the Frank era was an unmitigated disaster. Brought in to bring stability, pragmatism, and make Spurs tougher to beat, Frank failed by every count. Spurs may have been more defensive than they were under Ange Postecoglou. That's really not saying much, and have conceded slightly less goals, 1.42 per game, compared to 1.71 a game last season, but they are no more resilient as a team, they score fewer goals, and unlike under Postecoglou, there hasn't even been the same fleeting moments of brilliance and joy, where Spurs fans at least felt like they could feel what the manager was trying to achieve. There will always be those who roll their eyes when they hear talk of styles of play, or the X, Y, or Z club way, but part of the appeal of Postecoglou, and why he retained a core of Spurs fan support, who were loyal to him until the very last, is because his front foot football chimed with the great Spurs teams of old, and the idea of what Tottenham should be at their very best. Frank's football served up an awful lot of compromises on those ideals, with almost nothing in the way of upside in return. It is evident that the hierarchy at Tottenham didn't want to sack Frank, otherwise they wouldn't have waited quite so long, primarily because they wanted a so-called safe pair of hands to see out the season, before reassessing their options in the summer, with a full field of candidates to choose from. Only the growing and previously unthinkable threat of relegation, combined with the toxicity of the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and growing animosity towards Frank, ultimately forced their hand. Sacking a manager with a proven track record of getting teams out of the Championship is also a dangerous move for Spurs at this stage, you would have to say. The conundrum for Nick, Vinay Venkatesham, Johan Langer and Frederick Letnau is whether they appoint an interim manager until the summer, hoping a caretaker can carry Tottenham to safety before crowning a long-term successor, or whether they go with a permanent appointment now, increasing the calibre of manager that they are able to attract in their bid to stave off relegation, but potentially denting their long-term aspirations. Maurizio Pochettino is the name that is still being sung by Tottenham supporters, over 6 years since the club's controversial decision to sack the Argentine boss. Pochettino hasn't exactly set the world alight since leaving Spurs. He won one league title in a season and a half at PSG, followed by a single season at Chelsea, in which the Blues finished 6th. He has since taken charge of the United States men's national team, ahead of the US co-hosting the 2026 World Cup, which is why appointing him before this summer would appear to be a practical impossibility. If Tottenham wait until the summer, in the hope of landing Pochettino or perhaps Oliver Glasner, as say Manchester United have done, appointing Michael Carrick as an interim, they are very limited in terms of their options. Internally, John Heitinger would appear to be the only viable candidate, whose only senior managerial experience was a disastrous 15-game spell with his former club Ajax. Ryan Mason has been linked, again, but his appointment would hardly inspire confidence heading into a relegation dogfight. Meanwhile, it seems doubtful that Spurs legend Robbie Keane would leave Ferencváros, where he has a burgeoning reputation on the continent, for a fraught 12-game spell at Tottenham, which could thwart his long-term prospects in management, or even deal him a massive reputational blow. More left-field caretaker candidates include Jurgen Klinsmann, who previously saved Tottenham from relegation as a player, Tim Sherwood, who is really desperate for the job, and Harry Redknapp, who has also thrown his own name into the hat, having previously managed Spurs for 4 years. Personally, I think that would be madness. Redknapp has been out of work for almost a decade, with his only professional managerial experience over the last 10 years consisting of 13 games in charge of Birmingham City, where he was sacked with the club inside of the Championship relegation places, and 2 games in charge of Jordan's national team, with whom he beat Bangladesh 8-0, but lost 5-1 against Australia. Redknapp's laid-back attitude, based on the principle of trusting in his players, raising morale, and not overcomplicating things tactically, may work out if he was inheriting a demoralised but experienced group of players. When you think of the likes of Jonathan Woodgate, Ledley King, Jermaine Genius, and Darren Bent that he inherited back in 2008 at Tottenham. But the Tottenham squad now is a young one, desperately in need of direction, as well as belief and motivation. One of the few players to emerge from Tottenham's 2-1 defeat to an out-of-form Newcastle, which ultimately saw Thomas Frank sacked with any credits, was a 19-year-old Archie Gray. Talk of Redknapp, and more seriously one would imagine, and more widely reported, Pochettino, also further perpetuates the idea, perhaps not incorrectly, that the club is looking backwards, and that it will be more of the same following Daniel Levy stepping down as chairman, and being replaced by Peter Charrington as part of a broader management shakedown. If anything, some supporters fear, Spurs have gone from having one clear voice at the top of the club, whatever they thought of that voice, his priorities, ambition, or lack thereof, to being a club that is governed by committee with an even more laser-like focus on revenue and asset appreciation. It is too early to tell, in all truth, and the enforced sacking of Frank has likely thrown the club's hierarchy into a tailspin. Their aim was clearly to implement a very long-term strategy, reminiscent of FSG at Liverpool, or, God forbid, the Kroenkes at Arsenal, which might have taken 5 to 10 years to yield the substantive progress that Tottenham supporters crave. But you cannot look forward to your holiday excursions whilst your plane is nosediving, both engines are blown out, and you are hurtling towards the side of a mountain at 500 miles an hour. The only redeeming feature for Tottenham this season, under Frank's tenure, and I really do mean the only one, has been the club's form in Europe. Tottenham, bizarrely, when one thinks of their struggles in the league, won 5 of their 8 games in the league phase of the Champions League, suffering their only defeat against the reigning champions PSG. That was enough to see Spurs finish 4th in the league phase standings, 1 place above Barcelona, 4 above Man City, and 5 above Real Madrid. There are a few possible explanations for Tottenham's contrasting league and European fortunes. The most obvious is simply that the economic dominance of English clubs is becoming more pronounced, and Tottenham actually faced tougher opposition in the Premier League than they did in the Champions League, at least prior to the knockout stages. 5 of the top 8 in the Champions League phase, who advanced to the round of 16 automatically, were English clubs this season. Meanwhile, the 6th, Newcastle, finished 12th, level on points with PSG, qualifying for the knockout playoffs as a seeded club. Not a single English club, despite having more teams in the Champions League than anyone else, finished below Borussia Dortmund, Atletico Madrid, or Juventus. Only Newcastle finished below PSG, Inter Milan, and Real Madrid. It isn't Premier League or English exceptionalism and arrogance anymore then, and I say this as someone who feels great at ease about the financial and increasingly the sporting dominance of English football, rather than someone saying it with any relish, to say that English clubs now find regular Premier League games to be more difficult than the group stages, and even some of the earlier knockout stages of European competitions. Aston Villa also only lost 1 of their 8 games in the league phase of the Europa League, and relegation-threatened Nottingham Forest only lost 2. Meanwhile, Crystal Palace, who just lost 3-2 against Burnley in the Premier League, only lost 2 of their 8 league phase matches in the Conference League, despite rotating heavily in several fixtures. There is an argument to be had that Wolves would make the playoffs in the league phase of the Champions League, despite being statistically one of the worst Premier League teams of all time, and that Brentford, who it is worth reminding everyone are 10 points above Spurs in the Premier League, would conceivably finish in the top 8, just as Spurs did. Then there is the different levels of physicality and the ways in which games are officiated in Europe. The Premier League, always an outlier in terms of physicality and athleticism among Europe's leading leagues, has become incredibly physical in recent years, even by its own standards. It is now like the land of the giants with several teams, with a greater emphasis on speed, strength and set pieces than at any time over the last 10 to 15 years. Arsenal, who lead the Premier League table, are among the best examples, who could conceivably field a starting 11 entirely made up of players who were over 6 foot tall, and with 87% of their goals coming from corners. I just made that stat up, but you get the general idea. Premier League officials have also been instructed to operate with a light touch in recent years, in contrast to referees in Europe, who tend to be a fair bit more whistle-happy and have a lower tolerance for physicality. It's not inconceivable, I don't think, that Tottenham's young guns benefit from less physical opposition and greater protection from referees in Europe, when contrasted with the unrelenting onslaught posed by most Premier League teams. But hey, it's just a theory. Like gravity or evolution. Personally, I don't believe in either of those two, but it's a game of opinions. Tottenham's next game is the North London derby, which perhaps brings home why this season feels more painful and acute than last. It's not just the danger of relegation is far greater, and the crisis feels more permanent, it's also that Tottenham's bitter rivals Arsenal appear far more likely to finally turn their progress in recent years into trophies, while Spurs are at their lowest ebb of the modern era. Mikel Arteta's side have the potential to heap yet more misery on Spurs next week, which will be followed, for Thomas Frank's successor, by a tough trip to Fulham and Crystal Palace at home. Tottenham's remaining home games against Palace, Forest, Brighton, Leeds and Everton ought to inspire confidence ahead of the run. But Tottenham's home record at their exquisite £1 billion mega stadium is so abysmal that it actually does the precise opposite. Spurs have only won one game at home in the league this season since the opening day of the campaign. Only Wolves have collected fewer points at home than Tottenham's 10 from 13 matches so far this term. When one thinks that Tottenham fans cough up some of the steepest match day and season tickets in all of world football, over £2,000 for some of their season tickets and over £100 for some match day tickets, the value proposition appears to be somewhat lacking. Whether Spurs would sell out the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium in the Championship, ENIC will hope that is a question which never has to be answered. Spurs captain Cristian Romero stated on social media earlier this month, quote, "I wanted to be available to help them even though I wasn't feeling well, especially since we only had 11 players available. Unbelievable but true, and disgraceful," end quote, in a post that was liked by several of his teammates. It probably hasn't helped Spurs that Romero himself has already been sent off twice again this season amidst a major injury crisis, but most Tottenham fans back him in his critique of the club's ownership and senior management, however destructive and disharmonious it may be deemed by his critics. In previous videos about Tottenham, even when highly critical, I have always caveated my critiques with the fact that ENIC and Levy have made Tottenham a commercial juggernaut, and whilst fans shouldn't care about that in of itself, I don't think, it is relevant only insofar as it ought to insulate the team from catastrophe and guarantee that, with all the very fleeting exceptions, they are a highly competitive team, always in and about the European places, and well placed to capitalise upon economic
Why did he shoot that far? What the?
That argument
That was
is
so.
somewhat
He could have
undermined and
waited.
redundant. If Tottenham actually do the unthinkable and get
Nah,
relegated,
Mason,
though,
what's up?
something which should be an impossibility for one of the 10 richest football clubs in the world. The atmosphere at Tottenham is so toxic at this stage that some supporters would accept relegation. I have even spoken to some of them. If it meant ridding the club of ENIC and starting out again with a fresh impetus and ambition under someone else. Still, at least Spurs are top of the wage to turnover percentage table, or bottom, I suppose, depending upon which way you look at it. I don't know about any of you, but I always say that is the table that really matters.
Holy.
That is it for today's video. Thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And, of course, make sure that you are subscribed. And have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC7s, but also my second channel, Alphabotama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on various social media platforms, typically by the username at HITC7 should you wish to do so. And even more importantly, you can now support me additionally, should you wish to do so, either by heading over to the Alfie Potsdamer YouTube channel, where you can become a channel member here on YouTube, or even better still, by going to buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potsdamer, where you can do the exact same thing, but Google won't keep almost a third of it for themselves. Or even 40% of it, some people say. I don't know. Either way, it seems like daylight robbery. Anyway, those options exist should you wish to help me out. And, they still exist even if you don't. But I wish to see you all very shortly. Take care out there until then. Especially Spurs fans, it must be rough. I love you all very much. Bye.
Guys, welcome back to Deadball TV. We got Albert Kim from BB Ballers to talk Asian footy once again. In today's video, it's going to be agree or disagree. So how this is going to work is we're each going to say a statement about an Asian national team, coach, player, etc. And then we're going to say a number from 1 to 10. 1 is strongly disagree with the statement being said. 10 is strongly agree. I'd stake my entire reputation on that statement. Okay, so we're going to go through these one by one. If you want to see a part 2, then make sure you are subscribed. And of course, if you want to see anything related to either Asian football or the World Cup, make sure you're subscribed to both of our channels. BB Ballers will be linked in the description. Albert, thanks for coming back on. My first one here. Japan will disappoint at the World Cup.
Oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, man, this might shock some people because I do respect what Japan is doing. I'm gonna go with a 7.5. Am I allowed to do decimal points? 7.5.
You're allowed. I will give you the privilege of going decimal points. You're going 7.5. Okay.
Yeah. And the reason I'm saying that is because I watched your earlier video about the early World Cup predictions. I'm looking at the bracket right now, and I expect Japan to do well in the group stage, especially against the Dutch. I think they do well against European competition, but there's a good chance they end up playing Morocco. I think either in the round of 32 or round of 16. And if that happens, they're not. I don't think they make it out of that game. I think Asian teams have a hard time with African competition. I really do.
We can simply define what would a successful or what would a not disappointing World Cup be for Japan. Quarterfinal.
I think that's the bare minimum, right? Considering the expectations and the talent.
I think they're good enough to make a semifinal on talent. I don't think they have the manager for that, so that's a different discussion. I think if they made a round of 16, you would say, like, oh, here's another, like, pretty good World Cup from Japan, right? Like, we would all just move on once again. I think it's quarterfinal or better where you start talking like this was a success or even a glowing success for Japan. So if that is the expectation, minimum round of 16 to be like a net neutral, quarterfinal or better to be a positive, that means to not be a disappointing World Cup, you need to make the round of 16. And like you just said, if Japan wins the group, they will play the runner-up in Group C, who will most likely be Morocco. There is the possibility that maybe a Scotland sneaks in there. I do think that they're physical enough and defensively sound enough to maybe sneak something. Like, it's not an impossibility. It could even be Brazil if Morocco win the group, though.
Like, that Brazil-Morocco game could be close.
Yeah, and I just think if it's Brazil-Japan, I think it's over. Just like that, I think it's over.
And I think part of the reason is that, yes, like, we've had questions about Moriyasu for years, going back, Jack, to when we were in our mid-20s, I think now it's like, we're looking at Japan, and I also don't rate them in, like, knockout competition when it comes to penalties and extra time. I think they have a very good team. They have a good system. They just don't I think they're a bit meek, and I hate to say that, and to play into, like, a stereotype or whatnot, but I think they don't have the fire, especially when it comes to converting in penalty shootouts to go far in a tournament. And realistically, if you play Brazil, I think the best you can do is try to take them to pens. I know they beat them in a friendly a few months ago in Japan, but again, that's a totally different. That's not the World Cup. It ain't the same. It ain't the same as being in North America in the summer. The weather the Brazilians will be used to, by the way. So the way we look at it right now, just the way it's set up for them, I do kind of have it going out early, which is why I said 7.5. And had been another manager besides Moriyasu, someone who didn't experiment so much or just make some weird decisions that don't need to happen, I would maybe say Japan is going to make a quarterfinal, but right now I'm getting knocked out early like you.
I want to know what you guys think down below in the comments. And of course, everybody will have a different definition of disappointment. like for you and me, however, people love Asian football.